you want to? You're not using. Well, whichever. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ray Perman, and I'm director of the David Hume Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the midpoint of our Politicians and Professionals series 2016. We've had two seminars with the leader of the Labour Party and the leader of the Green Party, and this evening with Ruth Davidson, the leader of the Conservatives in Scotland, and two more to go. I'm told it's Groundhog Day today, 2nd of February. There's an obvious joke I could make about seeing Ruth again, but I'm not going to make that joke because it's too obvious. I did have to chide Ruth last year for being 10 minutes late, but that she warned us earlier in the day that because of her democratic duties at the Parliament and decision time being at 6 o'clock, it would be 6:30 before she could arrive here. Then she turned up a quarter of an hour early, so caught me completely unawares. But that is politics for you. We're delighted again to have the help and support of our sponsors, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Scotland, the Law Society of Scotland, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, the Faculty of Advocates, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And we're delighted also to have the Young Academy of Scotland as one of our partners. And at the end of the formal part of the evening, I will ask Neil McLennan from the Young Academy just to tell us very briefly about some of their work. Our chair this evening will be Catherine Thorne from the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. But now, enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Ruth Davidson.
Thank you very much, Ray. Good evening. Thank you once again for giving me this opportunity to speak to you this evening. And it's my opportunity once again to thank you for the tremendous work that you do as an organisation in providing impartial, evidence-based input to Scotland's national debate. From the continuing devolution issues to the thorny question of Britain's lagging social mobility, the David Hume Institute has led the way again in the last 12 months. And more than ever before in Scotland, we need fact-based arguments and scepticism towards anything which fails that test. As a fully paid up, or at least I hope, a fully paid up member of the reality-based community, I'd like to express my gratitude for the work that the Institute continues to do. So we're here, it's the beginning of February, it's Groundhog Day, as we've said. This is Scotland, so that means we must be at the start of yet another election cycle. We had the referendum in 2014, and I came to speak to you before that. We had the general election last year, and I came to speak to you before that. So the Groundhog Day theme does continue. We've got the Scottish parliamentary elections this May, and then the possibility of a referendum on the EU in very short order afterwards. So in this Six Nations week, I feel like I'm going for my own Grand Slam this year, and call me a glutton for punishment, but I'm excited and enthused about the 13 weeks that lie ahead of us before we once again head to the polls on May the 5th. And I think there are some crucial questions that lie ahead of us. The first is, how do we improve our education system so that it catches up with international progress in literacy and numeracy? How do we maintain a sustainable NHS in the face of massive demographic pressures? And how can we guarantee the same opportunities for the next generation, those opportunities of finding a decent job, of buying an affordable house, of supporting a family that previous generations in Scotland took for granted? Well, we in the Scottish Conservatives have already had plenty to say about these issues. We'll have plenty more. Indeed, in the first few weeks of this year, we set out some of them, calling for a switch in priorities to support more vocational education, reforms to our state school sector, and a less target-driven NHS. These, I suspect, will be the bread and butter of the campaign to come, and I believe that that would be right to do so. But if you'd allow me this evening, I'd like to take an opportunity to focus on somewhere other than public services. I'd like to focus on the other side of this election campaign, and that's a side of this election campaign we've never had at a Scottish parliamentary election before. Of course, with negotiations still ongoing between the Scottish Government and the UK Government on the fiscal framework surrounding a raft of new tax powers agreed under the Smith Agreement, it's clear that compromises are going to have to be made. But I'm working on the assumption at this time that there is enough common ground between Edinburgh and London for that deal to be done and to be done within the next few weeks. I'm also working on the assumption that as a result, the huge new basket of tax powers will be ready for devolution this time next year. And the reality of the changes ahead of us came home to us. In fact, I think they came home quite literally just a few weeks ago when HMRC started dropping letters into our homes informing us of the changes afoot, changes regarding a new Scottish rate of income tax. So it does get real in Scotland quite soon. It means that this is the first election where it can cost you as voters money, the first election where income tax will be set at Holyrood and not Westminster. And I think that's going to make this Scottish parliamentary election and the next Scottish parliamentary term very different from those who have gone before. Politics in Scotland ceases to be just a spending competition with choices about how you can best divide up the cake and nothing more. It now becomes about how best we raise the money to pay for those vital public services, how best we grow the cake to ensure that they survive and they prosper. Now, I don't need to remind the people in this room that we welcome this change wholeheartedly. It was the Scottish Conservative Strathclyde Commission 2 years ago which laid out the blueprint for many of these reforms. And as a party, we've gone on a long and quite tortuous at times journey, from first opposing devolution to now leading the debate on how best it develops. And as my colleague, the Secretary of State for Scotland, David Mundell, has rightly put it, we're now on the verge of devolution 2.0, what is, in effect, a new parliament. So the question now facing us is how these new powers are used, and what I'd like to do this evening is to set out our Scottish Conservative vision on how we should approach that task. So if we turn to these new tax powers, allow me first to bang the drum for the work we've commissioned on this that's come back in recent days. If you'd like to forgive me, I'd like to run through it in some detail because I think it's really important if we're going to have a fact-based, evidence-based argument in the months ahead. That work was contained in a document, a new report by the Independent Commission for Competitive and Fair Taxation in Scotland. It was headed by Sir Ian Macmillan, and this commission was set up by me in 2014 to study all of the new tax powers that were coming and lay out some of the ground rules on how those powers should be used. We wanted the Commission to ensure that Scotland wasn't put at a competitive disadvantage to our nearest neighbours, and at the same time, we wanted it to ensure that fairness was at the heart of all we did, fairness to taxpayers and fairness to society at large. So what did the Commission conclude? Well, it argued that in principle, our new tax system in Scotland should meet 5 basic tests. The first is that it should be simple. It noted how complicated tax systems usually only help those who can afford expert accounting and legal advice, and it decided that those should be avoided. Secondly, the tax system should be progressive. In other words, taxes should be linked to the ability to pay. The only question there being would be the degree of proportionality. Thirdly, it should be incentivising. Scotland's position on the geographic periphery of both the UK and Europe can sometimes be a disadvantage, and the Commission argued that we need a tax system which overcomes that potential disadvantage and ensures that Scotland is seen as an attractive place to both live and work. Fourth, we should respect local circumstances. Too much power has been centralised in Holyrood since devolution. The Commission argued that we should try to reverse that trend. And lastly, the Commission called for transparency. Still now, 17 years after devolution, people are not aware of the division of responsibilities across the UK. So it is vital that everyone is clear about where taxes lie and who levies them. So the Commission then examined the nature of the country around us, and it found that we're a country that's heavily reliant on a small number of very large companies and a large number of very small companies, and not nearly enough businesses in the middle. We are heavily reliant on oil and gas in one part of the country and on financial services in the other. We don't export enough, and we also are extremely reliant on foreign-owned companies and foreign direct investment. We only need to look at the decision taken last week by Texas Instruments and Greenock to announce job cuts to know how insecure such a situation can be. They also found that while our GDP is growing, that is due in part to high levels of expansion in public infrastructure and investment, which I fear can't last forever, however much we might like it to. And then they added to this a key point, that our ageing population is rising faster than in the rest of the UK and the European average. Over the next 20 years, the number of people aged between 60 and 74 is set to increase by 27%, and the number of people aged over 75 will rise by a staggering 82%. Now, this is, of course, reflected elsewhere in the Western world, but Scotland's age profile is rising faster than those of the countries around it. So the Commission concluded, in other words, that our country faces a challenging outlook. And so it was against this backdrop that the Commission examined specific tax reforms, taking into account the 5 principles of simplicity, progressiveness, transparency, locality, and boosting incentives, and examining the country around us. And it's pretty obvious that we need to grow Scottish businesses, both in size and in number. We need small businesses to become medium-sized firms so that they can start exporting more. And to do that, we need to grow our skills base and to attract more people to stay in Scotland and more people who have left to come home to Scotland. And you will have seen the specific recommendations the Commission provided in answer to this. A new middle band for aspirational families, and no increase in the additional rate of income tax, a freeze in the business rates, a reformed council tax, and an overall recommendations that taxes in Scotland should be no higher than the rest of the UK, and they should be lower when affordable. I would like to once again go on the record to record my thanks to Sir Ian and his highly accomplished team for doing such a thorough job. I believe that they have allowed us in Scotland to take the first step towards a more informed and more evidence-based debate around tax. So now that I've laid out for you the work that they achieved, let me set out some of my own thoughts on this matter. Firstly, I wholeheartedly agree with the approach that the Commission took in trying to grapple not just with a system that's competitive and business-friendly, but a system which is also seen as fair. That task is, I believe, vitally important. And if you just let me step outside the debate that we're having in Scotland right now to briefly illustrate the point. I think that right now there's a growing debate about the taxes that are paid by multinational firms such as Google and Apple and Facebook, firms which earn hundreds of millions of pounds from British taxpayers every year because, we want to gobble up what they're producing, we're involved, we're enticed by their offerings. But those firms, in return, despite getting so much from the British taxpayer, pay very small sums of taxation themselves. And I think that there's a frustration that people feel. Because when you ask a company about their tax affairs, a company like Google or Apple, you get the same reply, that they've paid exactly what HMRC has asked them to pay, and they've complied with the law. And they're right. But then when you ask the government for their response, you've got David Cameron, George Osborne, pointing out that no government has done more than theirs to crack down on tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. And they're right too. And the trouble is that both of these answers may be right, but it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel fair. And in our hearts, I think we all know that it isn't fair. And how can it be fair when you've got families across the UK seeing money taken off their paycheck every month before it even reaches them, only to see these fabulously wealthy multinationals able to dictate the sums that they choose to pay? And I think that the danger in all of that is that it erodes the trust in government and the system. And I think it further adds to the sense of simmering indignation that many people feel at a system that often seems rigged against them. And I think that indignation and that sense of unfairness really helps further the aims of those populists and the demagogues and the extremists, the Trumps and the Le Pens out there, who are hoping to exploit that resentment for their own narrow purposes. So the debate over our tax affairs in Scotland may seem small in comparison, but this current row just goes to show how utterly vital it is that we get this right, that we ensure simplicity, transparency, progressiveness, because without that, the contract between government and the governed breaks down, and our society, I think, is all the poorer for it. So while fairness is important, We can't simply ignore reality either, and that brings me to my second point. Because as the Commission pointed out last week, if we don't have a tax system which competes in the real world, which tries to attract business and people, then we will only ever succeed in starving our public services of the resources that they need. So we do need to get real, and we need to understand that the decisions that we take on tax don't exist in a vacuum. They affect behaviour, and they will have an impact on the money that we as a government, as a country, have to spend. So let me give you another example, and this time let me do it closer to home. Last year, I lobbied the Chancellor to cut the tax on whisky, and the industry made the argument that such a tax cut would help that industry invest, it would secure more jobs, and in the budget, the Chancellor agreed and duly reduced the duty. Now, industry has produced new figures that show that far from reducing the tax take to the Treasury, that decision has had the opposite effect. Spirits tax revenue has increased by £96 million compared to the year before, 2014, with Scotch whisky representing a significant proportion of that total. And as an aside, just let me say, I've not given up. I'm going to re-lobby the Chancellor next year for the Scotch whisky industry as well. But the point is that tax decisions have dynamic effects for both good and bad, and we need to understand the impacts when we make those decisions. And it's here that I have to say I find myself bemused by the approach of my principal opponents in this campaign, and by Labour in particular. Because today we learn that Labour have decided to use the new tax powers in the Scottish Parliament to propose a tax hike in the income tax of every working person in Scotland. This is also the Liberal Democrat position. Now, this will hurt every single taxpayer in the pocket. Both Labour and the Lib Dems are entering this election threatening to hammer family finances by raising the taxes of Scotland's workers. To give a few examples, the average taxpayer currently earning £26,000 a year would have to pay an extra £160 a year in tax. That's a 5% increase, according to the latest figures. Now, Labour's plan is to hand out £100 to people earning below £20,000 in order to help them out. But just think about that for a moment. Someone earning £19,999 would face an income tax hike of £89.99 under Scottish Labour's plans. But they would then, at the end of the following tax year, be asked to apply to their local council to receive £100 in compensation. They would be asked to stand in a queue at their local town hall with their payslip in hand as proof to ask for their own money back. Now, I don't know how much the administrative cost of that system would be, but I suspect it would be more than the £10 which this person is going to get as a result. So if you want a tax system that's designed with as much pointless complexity in it, you could barely do more. Of course, this is only one part of Labour's tax plan. Indeed, it was here just a few weeks ago, and I'm sure many of you were in the same audience, that my opposite number in the Scottish Labour Party set out her policy on tax. The well-heeled would have to pay more, she said, in order to pay for greater investment in education, which is classic Robin Hood Labour rhetoric. You take from the rich and give to the poor, and it sounds great, but the evidence shows that it doesn't work. Studies have been made into 3 countries which have subnational income tax rates. Those are Canada, the USA, and Switzerland. And the conclusion that those studies reach, albeit cautiously, is that there is a clear risk of behavioural responses by high earners if there are changes to their marginal rates of tax. Or if you put that in plain English, if taxes are increased on the wealthy, then there's a danger that they'll move or organise their tax affairs to minimise the amount they pay. And people can shout about this if they wish. They can complain about it. You can complain about the so-called willies, which is work in London, live in Edinburgh's. But if they decide they've had enough and just base themselves down in London completely, there is literally nothing that we can do about it. We can't stop it. And what I find seriously odd is that despite proposing an increase in the additional rate when the new powers come in, Labour appears to accept this too. Interviewed by Mandy Rhodes in Holyrood magazine last year, the Scottish Labour leader was asked how much a new 50p additional rate was raised. She replied, up to £100 million, but bluntly, Mandy, it could also raise zero because of the mechanisms by which people can avoid paying tax. So we're going to implement a tax policy. We don't know how much it's going to raise. It might raise nothing, but we're okay with that. So in short, Labour's plan is to raise taxes on the well-heeled, indeed just about everybody else as well. And apart from the tax take, these policies also send a message. And if that message is that Scotland should be the highest taxed part of the UK, then don't be surprised if businesses and people opt to find a different part of the UK in which to operate. And if every single employee and employer knows that people pay more tax here than they do elsewhere in the UK, then many will simply make a rational choice and opt to go elsewhere. So what are the lessons from all of this? I don't believe, as some of my more free market colleagues might, that we simply should slash every tax going as deeply as possible and wait for the money to pour in. Nor can we blind ourselves to the inequalities we see in society when it comes to the distribution of wealth, which is why a progressive system of tax, like the one we have now, will always be necessary. But I do believe in following the evidence. And I see nothing socially just in boasting about tax rises on the quote-unquote well-heeled, when you know that the resulting effect will do nothing to increase the exchequer and enable greater support for public services on which the poor rely. In short, empty gestures on tax may make those on the left feel better about themselves, but they don't butter parsnips and they won't encourage Scotland's businesses to grow. So I hope that Labour and the Lib Dems show they're up to the job and conduct the same kind of in-depth research as we have done into this, but I'm not holding my breath. What I think we need is a solution that works for Scotland. So the Commission last week cautioned against an increase in the additional rate of tax for exactly the reasons that I've laid out above, and I support them in that completely. But more importantly, the Commission also proposed the introduction of a new middle band of income tax set between the 20 and 40p rates, so it's not such a huge cliff to scale. It found that we, as a country, lack skills in a number of professional and technical industries. We need to find ways to develop these skills in our schools, in our colleges and our universities. But we can also use the tax system to encourage more people to move up the income scale and to help us attract more such skilled people from elsewhere in the UK. So a new middle band, reducing the tax paid by middle earners, could help us do just that. And I hope very much the Scottish Government gives it due consideration over the coming months as it prepares to take these powers on. I and my team will be studying this idea ourselves as we prepare our manifesto for spring, and it does seem to me to be a compelling proposal. I can also say that I'm attracted to the idea of freezing business rates for the course of the next Parliament. These rates have risen by 42% since 2007, in contrast to the 7% increase in council tax. If we really are to try and move to an economy which incentivises growth and boosts jobs, then it cannot be right to continually keep turning to business, large and small, as a convenient cash cow. That is exactly what John Swinney has done since 2007, and it's time he thought again, because we do need to think afresh. Now, I, of course, would love to lead that debate as Scotland's First Minister over the coming 5 years. I am not, however, blind to the facts or indeed the polls. So if you put it this way, while Scottish politics has seen its fair share of earthquakes over the last few years, I'm not yet measuring the curtains for Bute House. And the polls are pretty clear. The SNP has a huge lead. And we in the political field would be daft not to acknowledge it, even as we try to chip away at it. But that doesn't mean that this election has to be about continuity, that it's simply a rubber stamping exercise for the party of government. Because I believe that a proportion of the Scottish electorate do actually want change. Change from the constitutional bickering which has marked the last 5 years of Scottish politics, and change from the impoverished debate which has existed in Scottish politics when it comes to domestic politics. A debate in which policy ideas are measured only by pound signs as the soft left try to outleft each other. A debate in which Labour appears to believe that by shouting ever louder at the SNP, it will miraculously win back all the supporters it has lost in recent years. A debate between a government which knows only how to spend money and expects credit for doing so, and an opposition whose only imaginative response is to promise to spend even more. Followed by the predictable wave of grudge and grievance and the blaming of Westminster when inevitably the chequebook runs dry. So my election message is that in the Scottish Conservatives there is an alternative voice which will stand up to the SNP's constant flirtation with a second referendum. We'll also try to change the terms of the debate. And this will be difficult. If the SNP does get returned to power, I have no doubt whatsoever that it will seek to push forward with its plans for independence. Indeed, the First Minister expressly declared this as her intention at the start of the year. Nicola Sturgeon has had plenty of opportunities to rule out a second referendum and has conspicuously declined to do so. So I reached the conclusion that another SNP majority government would once again dust off the independence bandwagon from its previous term in office and get it going once again. And frankly, any political party leader who tries to tell you otherwise in this campaign is either utterly naive or desperately on the hunt for SNP voters. So my promise to people at this election is that I will do all that I can to ensure that we don't go back to another referendum, but that we go forward to a more productive future. Every extra Scottish Conservative MSP will be a bulwark against a second referendum and a new drive for separation. And together we will insist that the SNP focus on using these new tax powers to the betterment of Scotland, not continuing to flirt with a second independence vote. And that's not just because, as a unionist, I don't want it to happen, but also because I want a government in Scotland which doesn't take its eye off the ball. Because if we look at the consequence of this lack of focus, we have an education system where standards of literacy and numeracy have declined compared to our competitors. Only now, after 9 years in office, does the SNP declare it a priority. Well, that should have been the case in 2007, but the Constitution got in the way. We have farmers and crofters right now waiting on their CAP payments from the Scottish Government, waiting because the Government's new £180 million computer programme has botched up at a cost of £10,000 for every farm application processed, and still farmers are waiting for late payment. And we have a government which has failed entirely to tackle the country's growing housing crisis. Something in Scotland needs to change. And if we don't change the government, then I believe we should change the official opposition. So over the next coming 5 years, we will hold the Scottish Government to the job that we elected them to do. And we will push forward the debate on a better way forward for Scotland. We need in Scotland to think harder and smarter about the road ahead. We need a Scotland that backs active and energetic government and backs a progressive tax system that's needed to pay for it, but which doesn't believe that the state should do it all and doesn't see the need for punitive tax rises to pay for it, which knows that we need to find a distinctive path for our circumstances in Scotland, but which doesn't see the need to split off from the rest of the United Kingdom in order to make it. I genuinely don't see that kind of influence being brought to bear by any of the other parties in the Scottish Parliament right now, and I think it's needed. And I'm convinced that over the coming 13 weeks, we can convince the Scottish people that it's the Scottish Conservatives that can provide it. So at this election, I'll prove that we have a competent, cohesive team that's clear in its objectives, to hold the SNP to account, to protect family finances of Scotland's workers, to bring forward positive ideas on improving public services such as health, education and policing, and to stand firm against any second referendum. Scotland needs to move on, and it needs its two governments to work together, not see the sowing of false grievance. So we look forward to taking these arguments to the people of Scotland. Thank you very much.
So I think I'll just hand straight over to questions. I think there are microphones in the audience, and if you can state your name before you ask your question, please. I think the microphone's just in the way.
Thank you very much. My name is Elizabeth Meehan. Thank you for your very interesting talk. And I hope you'll forgive me if I ask a question about something which wasn't really mentioned in your talk. And that is the EU on this day, historic day. You'll recall that the argument was put forward at our last referendum that Scotland's place in the EU was safer if we remained in the United Kingdom. But now, given the complex mosaic of cross-cutting differences amongst Westminster MPs, not least Conservative ones, I wonder if you could tell us what factors will determine how Scottish Conservatives develop their campaign about the EU referendum, and if at this early stage, whether you can give us any idea of what the Scottish Conservative approach to the EU referendum might be.
Sure. There will not be a Scottish Conservative campaign on one side or the other. We believe that the referendum is a vote that's direct democracy, not representative democracy. It is up to each and every one of our individual members to vote in the way that they wish. Each and every one of our elected representatives in Scotland, across all parliaments, are free to campaign on one side or the other, should they so wish. To do so only with the caveat that they represent themselves and are not representing the wider Scottish Conservative Party. That's a pledge that I made, so when I very kindly got a phone call a few months ago asking me if I would go and serve on one of the boards of one of the campaigns, I turned it down. But I have made my own position very clear on this. I think that we as a country, should be part of a wider union. If anybody's listened to me at any point in the last 3 years, you know I quite like Scotland being part of wider union. It's something that I do talk about quite a bit. And I think if I bring that back, Elizabeth, to the start of your question about the Scottish referendum debate and talking about Scotland being safer in part of the United Kingdom, actually, what we were positing was that if Scotland was an independent country and seceded from the United Kingdom, which was the nation state of the EU, that it would have the same application process as any other new member that was wishing to go in. And that was backed up by several of the EU commissioners in written responses to questions that were asked. For my own part, I think we should stay in. I grew up in a household where every plate of food that was put down in front of me and my sister was because my dad made stuff and sold it abroad. He worked in manufacturing his whole life, first in textiles and then in whisky. I speak regularly and often to Scotland's business organisations who are pretty, they don't speak with one voice, but they're pretty united that it's better for Scotland's firms to be part of the largest trading bloc anywhere in the world. So I, last summer, went over to an outer think tank that's in part run by European Conservatives to stand in the Lion's Den and say why I thought we should be part of it, irrespective, actually, of the negotiation that the Prime Minister has brought forward. I don't think the EU's perfect. There are 6,000 things that I would change about it if I was in charge. But if you're one member in a 28-member organisation, you're never going to get things your own way. And I think that for me, it's an on-balance decision. And on balance, I think we should stay a part of it. I struggle, however, in this generation of Conservatives, to really get my pep up for it in the way that some of my senior colleagues do. There will be many people in this room who perhaps are older than me, who perhaps are older than 58, which is the age you have to be to have ever had a vote on our membership of Europe. I think it's absolutely right that we ask people to reaffirm whether we want to be a member of this organisation. I'm 37. I've never been asked if I wanted to be in Europe or not. It's just been a fact of my life. So I think it's a good idea to have. But if you are older than 58, if you have had that chance to vote on our membership of the European Union, you've probably also watched politics down the years and seen some of the titanic internecine warfare on the subject of Europe that Conservatives have had down the years. And I look at some of my colleagues who are gearing up for round 17 of this, and I do slightly struggle with it, if I'm honest. This, to me, doesn't feel like the referendum that we had 18 months ago. It's not, for me, about ideas of sort of national and personal identity. I don't think anybody goes to sleep under a European Union flag duvet cover in Scotland. I really don't. So I don't think any. I can promise you this. You're not going to see me jumping on top of a tank with a European Union flag flying behind me on this one, because it isn't about what I came into politics for. For me, this isn't a visceral decision that plays to all of those deep senses of identity that I had and was surprised by at the Scottish independence referendum. For me, this is an on-balance decision. And on balance, I'm one of these sopping wet Tories that wants to stay in. So there you go. A huge disappointment to all of my colleagues down south.
Next question. Someone?
you very much. Robbie Mockery, Heriot-Watt University. Ms Davidson, I must congratulate you on making me feel nostalgic for Margaret Thatcher. Not because of the content, but from what actually is omitted in what you were saying. Indeed, as you were speaking, there were large parts of what you were saying that I thought I could imagine the Deputy First Minister saying all of this when he's actually presenting his budget. Tomorrow, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so I'm almost wondering whether you have been imbibing too much at the wells of nationalism, or at least at the wells of careful prudence, but not actually thinking in what you presented. Although you talked about low tax, you didn't actually address what to me seemed to be the important issues from Thatcherism, which is the importance of supply side restructuring. And I'm just wondering, this is the boring bit, and I'm an economist, and I like doing boring stuff. So I'm perfectly prepared to accept that you'll go, oh, everyone will fall asleep by the time I've finished my answer. But I do wonder what you're actually thinking about in terms of the structure of the Scottish economy, particularly given that you've emphasised that there's no equivalent of the German medium-sized economies, which are so important to their economic growth.
Well, first of all, I can't say I wrote this incredibly dry speech about taxation with the Iron Lady in my thoughts in my head at all. There are Conservatives that can get past her, particularly when, as I said, I'm young enough that I was only 6 months old when she came to office. So I'm more maybe of a John Major Conservative than a Margaret Thatcher one. Yeah, I mean, I think there are real questions there. I'm not going to sit here and say that I have all of the answers, but I think that we do some things in Scotland really well, and we've got some really innovative work that's going on. For example, something like Entrepreneurial Spark, that's backed up by one of our big banks, works really, really hard to hothouse ideas and turn them into businesses. It works with businesses for the first sort of 6 months. It gets them to the stage where they're able to develop and start selling things, but it doesn't take them on to that next level. There's no, the help that it's available for people starting a business actually is there in Scotland, and that's, I think, a very good example of where it exists. There are also government-funded examples through Business Gateway. There's lots of ways in which you can help people get an idea off the ground, but once you've done that, there's no help really to make it fly, to make it soar, to scale it up, to get people into new markets particularly. You know, I think some of our agencies like SCDI, they do a good job. I like the reprofiling the UK government has done to make sure that we have sort of business-minded people at the heart of our embassy and consular network, to make sure that we're trying to use that network to help launch British companies, Scottish as well, around the world. But I'm just not sure that, you know, we're helping the small businesses get to that middle shaft, that medium-sized business there. Now, I am slightly, as somebody who is of the right and doesn't believe in state planning, to the sense that we have a 5-year tractor plan, that I'm maybe not the best person to design a plan to do this. But I think that, you know, it's not beyond the wit of man to look at schemes and systems that have worked around the world and try and import the best examples that we have of growing businesses from start. Because actually, you know, our universities are really good at coming up with intellectual property. They're really good at developing ideas. Some of our universities are in, you know, the top echelons in the world. But see, getting ideas and patents to market, that's where we fall down. It's making sure that we can develop the ideas that we have. When people have ideas that have turned into little acorns, it's about making sure that the mighty oaks grow. And I think there's also a big issue as well on productivity in not just Scotland but in the UK, that nobody's quite solved yet either. And if you look in stark contrast, even to countries that we might unfairly malign like France in terms of the working hours, you still see a workforce that has a higher productivity rate than you see here. So we're really hampering ourselves in global competition and in global markets if we can't get that up. But at the moment, we've found lots of different complex reasons. We haven't found any solutions. And if I had the answer, believe me, I would have given you a speech on that and not on boring marginal tax policy when new powers come to Scotland. So there we go.
Another question in the same row?
Thank you, Ronald Watt. You said you were going to concentrate on the taxation side. But I didn't notice you say much about local government taxation. Maybe I missed it, but would you prefer a higher amount of revenue to be raised from local taxation or a smaller amount?
Sure. Well, actually, we looked at tax, or the Commission looked at taxation because it looks at all of the taxes that are coming, and it's not just income tax. You're absolutely right. It looks at the taxation that we have control of in the Scottish Parliament, so local government taxation, some environmental taxes, but also the basket of taxes that are coming both as part of the Scotland Act 2010, which grew out of the Calman Commission, and then part of the Smith Commission that we've just recently had following the independence referendum. So there's changes that you've already seen brought in over land and buildings transaction tax, which has replaced stamp duty. That's a buildings tax. There is taxation over businesses that we already have. There's taxation changes coming over some environmental taxes and also on income taxes, and also VAT assignments. Under European law, you can't have a variance of a sales tax within a nation state that's a member of the EU, so we can't have control of our VAT rate in Scotland. But one of the things that the Smith Commission does, and this is something the Conservatives argued for quite strongly in the room, is that we would have a look at the assignment of VAT so that it became of benefit for everybody in Scotland to grow the sales within Scotland, because there would be a financial incentive for us so to do. So there's a lot in there. In terms of local government taxation, the clear recommendation from the Commission is that we develop a new format or develop the way in which we enhance payments to local government. At the moment, our party policy is that we'll keep the council tax freeze for the next year and look at reforming council tax after that. You will not be surprised as a Conservative in Scotland that we're treating this with, a gentle approach. We have form of making reforms to local taxation in Scotland, where it turns out if you reform local taxation, the people that do well out of it keep their head down and shut up, while the people that do badly out of it scream very loudly indeed. So we are looking at ways in which we would review, reform and change local government taxation. But that really is one for a manifesto, because it's quite a big commitment and not one for this audience here tonight. So I apologise for that. Sorry, Ronald.
Lady in the front here.
Hi, Alison Goff. I'm here in a personal capacity, but I'm currently involved in a review of secure care accommodation services for children and young people in Scotland. You talked in your speech, Ruth, about, you acknowledged the inequalities in distribution of wealth in Scotland, and you also talked about the importance of emphasis on education services and improving attainment and how we're lagging behind many other countries in Europe. I think one of the most shocking statistics is around the attainment of looked after children. And in Scotland in the last few years, I think there's been a great emphasis placed on early years and early education by all of the political parties. I wondered what your view is in terms of how we can address the inequalities for older looked after children, particularly young people in secure care and in custody, where we know we still have shocking outcomes for those young people later in life.
Sure. Your question specifically talks about slightly older children, but I don't want to dismiss at this stage looking at childcare for younger people, because we know that from 2, that's when the gap starts appearing between children who are disadvantaged, whether that's economic disadvantage, whether that is parental disadvantage, and various other measures that you can use. That's when the gap really starts appearing. And that's why it's important that when we were looking at childcare, and it used to be the case that it was really only sort of 3.5 and 4-year-olds that got any kind of socialisation with young people, that got any kind of work within a nursery system. Actually, we said it needs to be much earlier than that, because if you've already got a gap emerging at 3.5, 4, that child's going to struggle for the rest of the time. So I don't think it should be dismissed, and I think it's important that particularly for vulnerable 2-year-olds, there is that commitment that they get in early with the sort of childcare and development that we can as a country provide to them. I think in terms of looked after children, we have to be quite careful in thinking that there's a one-size-fits-all approach, because I don't think there is, and I think there's oftentimes a difference between children in secure accommodation, whether that's because of criminality or whether that's because it's children who are in foster care or in adoptive care. Personally, I struggle with a school system in Scotland that says that local authorities have to be the primary provider and that there is very little by way of independent thought and means that head teachers and teachers can do. I actually think that children aren't taught the same. Children don't learn this all the same. They shouldn't all be taught the same. And there should be much greater flexibility within the system for how we do that. Now, in terms of a prescriptive model directly for looked after children, I'm not going to stand here and say that we have one that's ready to go, that's written off the shelf. I don't think that anybody has found an ideal solution around the world. These gaps in attainment that you talk about aren't as bad in some other countries, but they do exist. I think if there was a perfect solution, we would all have adopted it by now. But I think there's one of those ones where everybody who's involved in the system needs to kind of get around a table and find out what works. Now, what works for one child doesn't always work for all of the others. Sorry, this is a terribly vague answer. I don't mean it to be. But if you're involved in the area, a number of members of my family are child social workers, so we have quite a lot of conversations about this around the dinner table. My nieces and nephews come from an adopted background, so we have quite sort of hands-on approach to this. It is difficult to write a lesson plan or a school plan that then fits all of the situations that you're talking about. But I think you have to empower head teachers to have the flexibility to be able to look after children who either might move a lot, who come from a background where there is no possibility or expectation that there would be help with homework or encouraged reading. This is how you help children in a school environment to catch up to their peers who are learning not just in school but learning at home as well. So I think it's something that not enough time has been spent on. I'm possibly guilty of that as much as any other political leader in Scotland, but more hard thought needs to be given to it. And if you want to come and speak to me after, I'm happy to discuss it further with you and to have you talk to my education team about it.
Thank you. Thomas Ward. Over the last 15 years or so, the outcome of educational achievement in deprived parts of London has improved probably more sharply than in any major city in the world. The reasons for this are now really quite well understood. It was a very deliberate series of changes, and they're now very widely studied and copied by other countries, with one fairly conspicuous exception, which is Scotland. I hardly ever come across a Scottish politician who's got any idea what I'm talking about. Do you think the Scottish Tories might try to change this?
We have looked at the London Challenge. It's one of the things that we think can fit in with other baskets of measures. I think there's some really good work that's going on down south, which we have empirical evidence works. So we have seen that something like Teach First, getting really bright graduates in to work in deprived areas, can help boost the teaching of schools. We also think that, for example, having the money following the pupil. At the moment, we've got a £100 million attainment fund in Scotland, which is going to be divvied up to the poorest areas in Scotland, to the schools that exist in the poorest areas in Scotland, which is fine to a degree, but it doesn't actually follow the poorest pupils in Scotland. And if you look at the work that I think it was Reform Scotland did, 80% of the poorest pupils in Scotland actually live in median to higher areas. So these are children who are at school where they have actually quite a lot of affluent peers who may be stretching ahead of them, but there's no extra resource going to be given to them to help them catch up. And it just allows for people to fall further and further in height. But I would actually look further than London, because I don't think it's the only scheme that works. And I think that we have to not be arrogant in Scotland and not look backwards at the time where we could hand on heart say that we had the best education system in the world and aren't we fantastic? Because actually, at the moment, we're not having the best educational results in the world, and therefore we have to look to improvements. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn from, example, the free school model that's been trialled in both Sweden and down south, technical schools that we see in Japan, charter schools that we've seen results for in both Canada and New Zealand. And therefore, we have to try and sort of cherry pick from around the world of what works and offer different options for people here. I agree that London as an inner city has benefited hugely from some of the changes that have been made. There are parts of Scotland, though, which are nothing like London and will require tailored solutions, and London solutions won't work in Moray, for instance. There is also an issue in London about school choice. Now, in lots of parts of Scotland, there is no school choice. So you can't move with your feet to a school that's getting a better result than a school that's, 4 or 5 streets away, because the nearest school is more than half an hour on a bus away, and your child is 11 and you don't want them spending over an hour on a bus every day. So, I think that there are significant issues that we need to look at regarding Scottish solutions, but that doesn't mean that we don't learn from elsewhere. We have, right at the start of the month, in January, we put out a booklet called Gold Standard, which is about raising the attainment in all schools. We had a number of policies that came from the London Challenge that were in that booklet, but we'd also looked at different systems around the world and added those in too, because we think that there is a mix there that could work for a particularly Scottish profile.
I'm going to be very cheeky and ask a question myself, if
Oh,
I may.
go on then.
So I was very interested that you used the word fair a lot in your talk, and certainly in my career as an actuary, I think I've had more discussions about fairness than I have about anything else. And one of the things, key things at the moment, I think, is the intergenerational question of intergenerational fairness when we're looking at things like pensions and distribution of income and wealth. Do you think our political system is set up to give a sufficient incentive to take long-term views to address these issues?
I think that there has too often been an incentive, not just in our system actually, but in all democratic systems that have regular voting intentions, to kick the can down the road. And I actually wouldn't use an example from here on this. I would use the American example of the third rail of Social Security. There have been, blue ribboned cross-party committees on Social Security reform in America for as long as I have been alive, and possibly from before then. And never have they actually got down to reforming Social Security, because old people vote and they vote in number. And I think that you also see some of these shibboleths in the UK, although because of the way in which we've set up quite a lot of the benefits, for want of a better word, although they're not always, benefits in the monetary sense, that it's easier to break them up in a way that it's not as easy to do in the American example. So, for example, moving and equalising pension ages is something that's, quite, there's a controversy about that at the moment. But if pensions were set up post-war to look after people in the last few years of their life when they stop working, but people now aren't living sort of 5 years past retirement age, they're living 25 years past retirement age, and you no longer have 5 workers to every person that's receiving a state pension, but you've got 3 workers to everyone that's receiving a state pension, then actually do you have the capacity as a country to be able to carry that on? Do you have the political will? Because a pot is only so much. And I think pensions is a particular difficulty, particularly in trying to get voter buy-in for it, because people assume, because they've paid national insurance their whole life, that means they've paid into a pot that exists and is sitting there for them to get paid back out of. And it's not. So the people who are paying taxes now, so myself, I'm paying for my parents' pension. My parents haven't paid into something that's then returned to them. My parents paid for their parents' pension, and so on. So I think that there is an issue about that. Do I think it's getting harder for young people in the world? Yes, I do. Do I think that there is also a change that we need to have in our attitude and the way in which we talk about the ageing process and work and all the rest of it? Absolutely. I think far too often we talk about an ageing demographic and people who are beyond working age as a burden or a problem we need to fix. And actually I think they're also, beyond that, they're also a resource we need to use, because there's a huge amount of experience and also energy and time that's involved there. And I think there's also a challenge for policymakers on the unpaid work that people who are no longer of working age do. So if you're looking at the number of people who are beyond working age who are full-time carers for a partner, or an even more elderly parent, that saves the economy millions of pounds every year. If you see the number of grandparents that work as free childminders for their grandchildren, I'm pretty sure there's going to be a few nodding heads around here. My mother is one of them for for my nieces and nephews. You know, that saves the economy, that saves everybody a lot of money. So I think there's a real attitudinal change that we need to have in this country as well. And other countries have done it. You look at somebody like Japan, and you know, there's a real honour system involved with older members of society that we don't have. But does it mean that some politicians have taken a cheap way out and thought we can't axe the free TV licence because it'll cost us the grey vote? Yeah, they probably have. They probably have. Should they have? Probably not. Did that get them re-elected? Probably did.
Gentleman on the end there.
Coming back to, Chris Carr, coming back to the Google tax.
Sorry, Chris, can you put your hand up so I can't see you?
Sorry.
There you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Coming back to the Google tax, I have a feeling that it has to be addressed at sort of at least EU come America talks. But has corporation tax perhaps now become so discredited that it would be simpler just to move to an extra couple of % on VAT? I'm a little bit out of date on what the proportion of the tax take is from corporation tax, but I had the impression it was actually not that brilliant a tax raiser. Is that another possibility that we look again at the basis of corporation tax?
Well, I don't have the figures for the percentage GDP that corporation tax pays into the exchequer. I'm sorry, I don't have that number at me. But it is a significant revenue raiser. It has been coming down to try and make the UK a more dynamic economy. At the same time, you've seen the number of jobs grow in the UK as corporation taxes come down. They're now at their highest level. And if you look at unemployment rates, we're far lower than other comparable European states, France, Germany, etc. Whether there's a causal link between the two, I think there is some evidence to suggest that there is, and that these things haven't happened in silo. I, for one, would be entirely uncomfortable with saying that we take no money from corporations who operate in our country, but we would therefore increase the amount of money we ask people to pay in buying their products, if we're considering this to be a manufacturer. So at the moment, corporation tax is at 18% and VAT is set at 20%. I think that there is a balance to be struck between the amount of money that's paid into an exchequer from individuals who are purchasing an item and corporations who are operating in a country and are using resource. They've had roads built for them up to their company's headquarters. You know, they've had sewerage put in. I see Athol Duncan there, formerly of Scottish Water. You know, all of these utilities, what companies take from a country as well as what they give back. I think that there is a fair division. I think that you see governments moving the line, but I don't think you'll ever see governments decide that there should be zero taxation from companies. I just don't think that you'd be able to function and provide the services that you need. You know, if you have companies or businesses or operations that are incredibly heavy or manual, then it is absolutely right and proper that the heavy or manual company who's putting stress and strain on the workforce contributes to a national health service that treats their employees if there is some form of impact on them from the work in which they're carrying out. I think that is part of having that contract of fairness in our country. And I don't think that you then have an employee in that situation that should be paying 40% VAT because their company's paying absolutely no corporation tax. So I think there is a balance. I think it's a fine balance. I think that at different times in the cycle of a country, what's seen as fair, what is the way in which the totals add up changes. And I think you've got to be quite deft and quite nimble as a Chancellor of the Exchequer to make sure that that contract that we have as a nation with both the government and the governed is seen to be a fair one.
So gentleman there. At the back.
Oh, good evening. Mike Ash in a personal capacity. I'm one of those people that's so old that I actually campaigned in the last referendum on Europe and been very interested in politics all the way through. And I have to say that your remarks this evening, if I'd closed my eyes, could have been straight out of New Labour in 1997. And in fact, I think you were somewhat softer on a number of issues than some of those people would have been. And I did wonder that if we take the view, if the EU referendum goes such that we remain inside and perhaps some of the headbangers go and hide back in the cupboard, and there isn't an issue about another referendum in Scotland, whether there is a period when there may be some sort of realignment in politics in the centre. I'm not expecting any major announcement from you this evening, but I'd just be interested in your general view about how politics in the broader sense is moving forward in Scotland.
Sure. Well, I have to tell you, I've been called Margaret Thatcher down here and softer than New Labour up there. I've been insulted in better places than this, let me tell you that. I won't tell you which one I thought was more insulting. No, I think there's a question mark, and it's not actually just a question mark in Scotland about the politics of the centre and the rise of the politics of the extremes. And I don't think you have to look very far to see Syriza and Podemos, the Front National. You see, Trump and Cruz, who are, as George Galloway would say, two cheeks of the same bum. Bernie Sanders, you see Jeremy Corbyn. There is a real sense of tension and discord, not just in our country, than elsewhere. And I think for people who believe in a broadly central proposition, whether that's centre-right like myself or centre-left like John Swinney, the other person I was compared to this evening, keep them coming. I think we have to work really, really hard because in a country where it is easier to get on the television or the radio or to make an impact on social media by screaming from the extremes, making the one-line riposte. Actually, it's harder to sell something that's more than one line. It's harder to sell something that is complex, sometimes conflicting, harder to sell something that's more of a paragraph or even several paragraphs, and making sure that people listen, because people are busy. They say that on average, people will consume less than 7 minutes of news a day, whether that's in a newspaper that they pick up on their bus, whether that's, they are eating tea and there's Reporting Scotland on in the background. I mean, you've got an infinitesimal time to try and get your message across. So it benefits you to boil everything down to one line. But I think you do the people of our country a disservice if that's the politics that you choose to pursue. Yes, I might have bored many of you this evening. Yes, I might have droned on in answer to some questions to try and add a little bit of context there. But I think it's important that when you have, particularly in Scotland, where politics feels big right now, since the referendum, since before the referendum, it feels like people are engaged. They're hungry for politics. They're hungry for explanation. They want to challenge. And I think that's good, and I think it's healthy. And we also have an electorate in Scotland whose votes are very mobile. There's been huge movement within votes within Scotland. Then I think that there is an incumbency on people to fight for the centre and not be dragged off to the fringes, and to explain to people that, yeah, you know what, this might be quite dull, but it's really important, and that the levers that you pull, they have consequences at the end of them, and trying to explain to people why, not just what you're doing, but also why you're trying to do it. Sometimes we maybe all get consumed with just battering the other person around the chops a bit because there's an election coming. But there is an incumbency on all of us to try and have a mature debate in this country. And I maybe didn't frame it in the best language in this speech, but I do think in Scotland, particularly with the repeated underperformance of my own party, actually the debate in Scotland's not been that mature. I think that the immaturity of the debate has in times been exacerbated by a Scottish Parliament where, we've had a nationalist government where it has been to their political advantage to go around saying that everything good in Scotland is because they spent money on it, and everything bad is because that bastard George Osborne wouldn't give them enough, and that's worked really, really well for them. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily allowed us to have a mature debate about either our spending priorities, our policy priorities, and that's why I think, as dull as it may be, having a rebalancing where we're not just talking about the spending in Scotland, but also the raising of revenue in Scotland, not just what money's given to, but where it comes from, will help with the maturity of our debate. I also think that the weakness of the right in Scotland, again over, I think, 2 decades, has allowed a soft left consensus to develop, which actually isn't shared by a lot of the electorate. So if I can give you some examples, and cut me off if I do go on so long, because I can go on about this for hours. There is a consensus in Scotland that we are somehow much nicer than the rest of the UK, and somehow we want to give more benefits to everybody than the rest of the UK, and we want unemployment benefit to be higher than the rest of the UK, and we think that that awful Tory government down south shouldn't institute a benefits cap. Every single piece of quantitative and qualitative analysis that exists shows that something like the benefits cap, you should not receive more in benefits than the average person earns in a wage, is more popular in Scotland than it is in the rest of the UK. But you wouldn't think it from the public discourse in Scotland. Similarly, there is more support for retaining Trident nuclear weapons in Scotland, poll after poll, survey after survey, than there is for not renewing nuclear weapons in Scotland. Now, again, you would not think that from the public discourse, because you have the major party of government and the major party of opposition are both coming from a political hinterland that's sort of sharing each other's clothes. And I think that the weakness of my own party has resulted in a weakness of debate in Scotland. And I think that, if I weren't the leader of this party, if I wasn't a member of the Scottish Conservatives, if I was just a concerned neutral voter, when I was a journalist and I wasn't a member of any political party, and I was looking at the debate in Scotland, I think as a political neutral, I would want to see there to be a clash of ideas, to test what the government's putting forward, to have that debate, to make sure that policies were, tested in fire, so we knew that they were robust, and it wasn't just this sort of soggy consensus of it'll do because actually the other guys are not going to challenge as much on it. And I think that there is a real space for the Conservative Party. I hope very much we revive. We're on course to have our best Scottish return in terms of both votes and seats in the Scottish Parliament. But I hope for a wider point to be made that revival can result in a more tempered debate, a more mature debate, a more blood and guts debate, actually, that actually takes on the issues head on, and we have those ideas of left and right tested in a Scottish context, because I just feel it's been missing from the debate in Scotland for a really long time.
I think we've just got time for one final question. The gentleman in the red tie near the back.
Thank you. I shall try not to compare you to anyone, and certainly not to insult you at all. You mentioned just then the idea of a revival in Scotland, and maybe this question is therefore apposite on that. You've talked about a point in the opinion polls, given the slightly convoluted electoral mathematics that we have with the system for Holyrood, at which point the ratio of seats per vote gets much, much stronger for you. So if you get a little bit better in the polls, suddenly you get a lot more seats per vote. How far away from that point are you, and how achievable is it?
If you've ever heard a politician ahead of an election give a seat prediction, they've not been a politician for very long. And they won't be for much longer. However, we are on course to have our best result. That's the challenge that I set the team when I came in as leader about 4.5 years ago, that within one electoral term we'd get from our worst ever result at Holyrood to our best ever result at Holyrood, and we're on course to achieve that. You're right, the way the system works, the D'Hondt system, you have 56 top-up votes from the regional list that get added to the 73 first-past-the-post votes. You've got 73 of the 129 seats in the Parliament that are the same as a sort of UK general election. Whoever wins, wins. Great. You then have a regional list vote for the regions of Scotland, wherein the number of votes that you receive gets offset against the number that your party and others have already won within that region, first past the post, and then get divvied out on a proportional basis to try and top it up. For the Conservatives, over the last few elections, it has usually worked out that we get an additional seat per percentage up to about 15%, and then between 15 and 16%, we get sort of 3 seats, sort of 16 to 17, we then get, it then becomes a really big curve like that. So I'm sitting here 92 and a half days away from polling day, and I'm cusping on the point where I'm going to get really excited. So in terms of all of the public interest polls that are out there that anyone can look at, their own work that we're doing, very detailed work that we're doing ourselves. My job is to have a good enough campaign that I don't just put us up this much, I put us up this much. And that's the challenge for me. And as well as a challenge that makes me very excited, because I want to see, a greater group behind me. I want a stronger Conservative voice. I want to be able to have the sort of debates that I'm talking about to increase the heft that we have within the public discourse in Scotland, to stop the Scottish Conservatives being the punchline to a lot of journalists' jokes, as we have been for the last 20 years. I also feel a really great responsibility, because a lot of politics is about narrative. And the SNP are very, very good at using the narrative of momentum and inevitability. Really good at it. And if we have an election in May, wherein the Green vote goes up and they get more seats, which all the polls suggest, the SNP vote continues to rise and they return another majority, which at the moment the polls currently suggest, although, that can change, and all of the pro-UK parties have a bad night, then suddenly that narrative of, well, independence is just around the corner, Scotland's changed its mind since the referendum, they've had buyer's remorse, it's now only a matter of time, there's inevitability, then that becomes a really, really strong narrative to take hold. And it's also a narrative that's being given relentlessly by the party with the biggest microphone, and that is always the party of government. Party of government always has the biggest microphone. So I think there's a real responsibility on me to make sure that I don't just increase our vote a little bit, but that I increase it a lot. So there's at least one pro-UK party that can say, hey, hold on a minute. This is still something that needs to be debated. There are 2 million voices that you don't get to ignore who have already cast that ballot. And I simply don't see that sort of improvement coming from my Labour Party colleagues, who are on track to have their worst ever election. I think all the polls would suggest that. Or the Liberal Democrats, who had a really bad election last time and don't seem to be showing any improvement from the 5 seats that they have. So there is a real responsibility on me in terms of stopping the inevitability argument in Scotland to have a good night on May the 5th. And I know 165 people came here or put their names down for tonight's event. So any of you or your friends want to help with that by voting for us, I'd be delighted. So thanks very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ruth may have been insulted in better places than this, but we are very grateful for her coming back to this particular place, not to be insulted, but to be questioned and to answer so frankly the questions which you put to her. So can I ask you again just to thank Ruth Davidson and also Catherine Thorne for chairing so ably this evening. I'm going to ask in a... I'm going to ask Neil McLennan of the Young Academy of Scotland just to close the formal part of the evening with a very brief suggestion of their description of their work. But may I just remind you that our next seminar in this series is on the 16th, 2 weeks tonight, with Willie Rennie of the Liberal Democrats. But now I'm going to hand over to Neil.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you very much to both you and to Catherine and the team for, again, pulling together these events. Thank you to Ruth for giving an insightful, honest and frank discussion tonight. I'm really conscious that the only thing standing between you and a glass of wine is me, so I'm going to keep to Ray's brief of keeping this very short. The Royal Society Young Academy of Scotland was formed in 2011 by the Royal Society. Now, there should be a lovely banner sitting behind me which gives a neat media one-line strapline of Voices of the Future, and that, coupled with our recruitment strapline of Contributing Public Good, gives a bit of an idea of the territory in which we operate. We have members from across Scottish society, from humanities, from the sciences, from professions, from the public sector, from charitable sector, and from business itself. And they were brought together to address some of the issues within Scottish society in that interdisciplinary platform. Since its inception, the 150 members have been engaged in advocacy, in direct action, and in raising awareness across a wide range of themes, some of which will be well known to you through our work. And that goes between health and wellbeing, the open data working group, to arts and humanities in the Parliament. So it's a wide range of areas that we've been involved in. In terms of outputs, the members have contributed to parliamentary calls for evidence. They have produced resources for Scottish school children looking at numeracy, which is an area that we're particularly keen to support, to our very popular Research the Headlines blog, which some of you may know. And it's with regards to the last area that I want to do as a former school teacher and as a senior education officer. I want to leave you with 3 pieces of homework, if that's okay, before you leave here. And as a good Domini, I'm going to pass the learning to you to take away. So first of all, I'm going to ask you to have a look at the Research the Headlines blog, which can be found at researchtheheadlines.org. On there, you'll find a variety of articles from our research body, which challenges some of the more erroneous and sometimes nefarious headlines that appear within our newspapers and media. You'll find everything from will Trump win with square-jawed voters to will skinny jeans affect your health? Now, I had to be very careful when I was reading those two to make sure I didn't get health and Trump mixed up there. The second thing I want you to do is to have a look at our 5-year strategic plan. The Academy did a lot of work over the last year looking at what are the issues that are coming up within Scotland, within Europe and beyond, and how can young professionals, young academians, young researchers and those involved in the charity sector contribute effectively to shaping that and also delivering better outcomes. The last thing I would ask you to do, particularly taking back to your own organisations, we are about to recruit our next batch of members, taking on board potentially another 50 members from a range of backgrounds. I'd ask you to have a look at the website and to think about members within your own organisation who are already well established within their career, have the capacity to work across disciplines and have the capacity to deliver better outcomes for Scotland and beyond. And so, with your homework in place, I'm going to take account of local circumstances, be very simple, be very transparent, be very progressive, and ask you if you would like to join us for a drink before you leave. Thank you very much.